The stranger put a finger to her lips, asking if the girl was ready to go back. A shout rings out nearby, saying the mistress is awake and they need to call the maids. The heroine opened her violet eyes after sleeping and didn't understand which mistress had woken up. The girl sat up sharply in bed, not understanding where she was, and the woman beside her was overjoyed that her mistress had woken up. The heroine rubbed her forehead and asked what happened, mentally not understanding what was going on. The blonde remembered the stranger from her dream and couldn't figure out who she was or what the maids calling her mistress meant. The girl couldn't understand where the unfamiliar memories in her head came from, and the maid was begging her to answer. Suddenly, a man in a cloak entered the room, and everyone inside turned to look at him. The man walked confidently towards the bed, and the servants thought that the master never came without warning. The maid, clenching her fists, announced that the mistress's condition was critical. Walking up to her, the stranger said he expected her to scream and start throwing things the second she laid eyes on him. The girl clutched her chest, totally bewildered by the giant standing in front of her. Ignoring the maid's plea to let the lady rest, the stranger approached the woman and said, "She's always like this." Picking up a strand of her hair, the man said she's just faking it, pretending to be in love again. The master said he should have controlled himself, then announced he'd be away from the mansion for a while. Watching him leave, she thought she must be dead. She has a husband and it looks like they're not exactly getting along. The girl stared after her man, trying to make sense of what the heck was going on. The lady tried to get out of bed, but the girl who rushed to her side warned her she needed rest because of her injury. Ignoring the servant, she got to her feet and tried to take a few steps forward. Feeling a killer headache, she braced herself against the mirror as these foreign memories kept flooding her mind. Looking in the mirror, the lady saw long, silvery hair cascading in curls. Bright, wide violet eyes stared straight ahead, and a flicker of recognition sparked within them. The moment arrives when the heroine remembers her name, Sherial Loperam. The Empire's most beautiful lady, Duchess Loperam, and the neglectful mother of the main character from the novel, Broken Wings. The heroine grabbed her head, realizing she'd become a character in the novel she'd been reading. One part of her begged to stay calm, while the other panicked because her character barely even registers in the story. Sherial slapped her cheeks, confirming she wasn't dreaming when she felt the sting. The heroine looked down at her bare feet, unable to grasp that her surroundings were reality, a reality she'd have to live in. Catching herself thinking that she'd actually have to live here, the girl went into total shock. Sherial couldn't understand why she was the mother of the main, totally messed up character who took a lot of people out, instead of some side character. The Duchess knew her son might eventually off her too if she got in his way. The young man grabbed the girl's hand and she demanded he let her go. The guy said if she wanted to leave, then so be it because he's a generous guy. But the stranger warned her that if he caught her, she better be ready. Ready for her legs to be shackled in iron, so she could never leave the main character again. Looking in the mirror, Sherial thought the main characters in these kinds of novels turn out that way because of how they're raised. The girl realized that evil parents especially play a role. In those cases, the main character gets rid of anyone who annoys him. The heroine thought the boy clearly had a bad father, and then realized she wasn't exactly parent of the year material either. The Duchess was freaking out. She thought she just had a bad marriage, but now she had a psycho son obsessed with the heroine. Sherial decided that if she wanted to survive, she needed to fix her family relationships before it was too late. This woman couldn't decide if she should deal with her messed-up husband first or the son she hadn't thought about in years. While she was mulling it over, she glanced out the window and saw a kid outside. The boy was wearing a light blue suit, and Sherial thought he was pretty cute. But suddenly, a thought hit her like a ton of bricks. She realized that if this was the boy from her memories, then this little cutie was going to grow up to be her psycho son. Sherial thought she'd never seen main characters this young and this good-looking. He was totally different in the novel. The Duchess decided she'd rather deal with a cute kid than a monster of a husband. But then she started second-guessing her decision, because there was a slight complication. Sherial couldn't figure out where to even start, how to make the first move towards the kid. The next day, a maid came into her room and told her it was time to get up because breakfast was ready. The maid asked if Madam was all right, and the girl told her she was doing okay. The woman said that Sherial shouldn't worry about the mansion's affairs for a while and should focus on recovering. The heroine called for Margot and asked how many days she'd been unconscious in bed. The maid said it had been several days, and the Duchess replied that she didn't feel rested and was recovering slowly. Margot said it was a really close call, and everyone thought Madam had been hurt in the carriage accident. Sheriel started on the breakfast that had been brought in and said she understood everything perfectly. The girl thought that her husband had come into her room despite their strained relationship, but she hadn't heard anything about her son since waking up. The heroine called for Margot and she answered right away. Sheriel asked if Cardizel was busy, and the maid said yes but couldn't say what he was doing. Sadly looking at the maid, the girl realized that things were way worse than she thought, but she wasn't about to just sit around and do nothing. The Duchess wanted to know where Cardizel was, and Margot said the young master was in the garden. The maid leaned in and asked if she was planning on going to see him. Sheriel crossed her arms, remembering that Cardizel in the novel couldn't read people's feelings. She knew her son was younger now, and she definitely needed to make the first move, but it was still a little scary. She decided to see the boy ASAP because a seriously messed up relationship would take forever to fix. The maid saw her mistress had been quiet for a while and apologized for talking such nonsense, then wished her a good rest. Margot was already leaving the room, but suddenly the lady, now sitting up in bed, called her back. Sheriel said there was something she needed to see and asked her to escort her to the garden. The maid asked if that was all right, since Madame wasn't fully recovered yet. Smiling sweetly, she assured the girl that everything would be fine and asked if she'd help her. Margot was totally on board, promising to get the lady of the house ready for a stroll in the garden right away. Sheriel remembered that before Cardizel met the heroine, the mansion's garden was actually gorgeous. But in the novel, it was completely overgrown with vines, so the girl couldn't escape. The heroine started searching the garden for her son and found him just a few moments later. The boy was sitting at a table, munching on something, totally oblivious to everything around him. Cardizel stared at the food on his fork and said it was super yummy. Peeking out from behind the bushes near the table where the little guy was eating, Sheriel figured he had a sweet tooth. With sadness in her eyes, the heroine thought about the old Sheriel and couldn't understand how she could forget about such a wonderful child. The girl noticed her son had cream all over his face and thought it was absolutely adorable. Gazing at Cardizel with adoration, the Duchess could barely stop herself from going over to the boy and wiping the cream off his face. Oblivious as ever, the young master kept right on eating. Suddenly, the kid started looking around, heard some rustling and asked, "Who's there?" Sheriel and the maid realized they'd been spotted and dove back into the bushes, quick. The heroine asked Margot if they'd been made, and the girl said yeah, and the kid yelled towards the bushes that he could hear women. Deciding there was no point in hiding anymore, the Duchess stood up and walked over to the kid, saying hello. The kid asked his mother what she was doing out here, and she said she was just taking a stroll in the garden. Sheriel asked if Cardizel would mind if she joined his little tea party. Without saying a word to the heroine, the kid sighed and hopped off the bench. The young master walked away from the heroine, not saying a single thing to her. The girl figured the little dude was trying to ditch her and decided she wasn't gonna let that happen. Sheriel gently took Cardizel by the sleeve of his snow-white shirt. Dropping to her knees in front of her son, the Duchess begged him to wait, not to leave. The heroine looked tenderly at the boy and asked him to give his mom just a minute. Cardizel stared intently at the woman in front of him, not understanding the reasons for her behavior. The little guy gathered his thoughts and decided to answer his mother's question after all. The young master paused for a moment, then answered in the negative, hiding his eyes behind his bangs. Snatching his hand away from his mother's grasp, Cardizel shouted that he didn't need a mother. Remaining silent at her son's response, Sheriel wondered if she just wasn't good enough for him. The boy quickly ran from the place where his mom had stopped him, not responding to her cries. Suddenly, a small gray stone appeared in the boy's path, barely visible in the grass, and Cardizel tripped over it. Seeing her son stumble and fall, Sheriel screamed his name in fright and ran towards him. The boy noticed his mother running towards him, told her to get lost, and asked her to stop pretending to care. The heroine saw the scrape on his knee and asked him to let her help with the boo-boo. Cardizel yelled at the girl to back off and told her he didn't need her. The kid got up from the ground, looking at his mom with eyes full of hurt and pain. The young master ran off again, and all the servants and Sheriel chased after him. After what happened, the heroine sat in the garden and mumbled her son's name in confusion. Late that night, the girl stood by the window, staring into the distance, trying to figure out what the heck just happened today. A memory flashed through her mind of the moment the kid fell and hurt himself. The heroine worried if the boy would be okay. Plus, Cardizel hates his mother more than she initially thought. Sheriel figured the kid wouldn't be back in the garden after what happened today, so she took away his chill spot. She figured the little dude was probably pretty thrown by his mom suddenly switching things up like that. The Duchess turned away from the window and headed to the desk with the paper, racking her brain on how to connect with her son without going overboard. Picking up the quill, Cheryl started scribbling a quick note. When she was done, she called for Margot, who'd been hanging out near the door the whole time. She slipped the letter into an envelope and handed it to the maid, asking her to give it to Cardizel. Cheryl said it was late for a letter, but it still needed to be delivered and handed directly to the young master. Cheryl confided in Margot that she really wanted to get closer to her little boy. The maid looked at her mistress with excitement. It was the first time in ages she'd wanted to actually spend time with her son. The girl asked the Duchess to trust her, promising to deliver the letter safe and sound. A few days later, Cardithiel woke up to find a huge gift box sitting on his bed. The kid glanced at it, annoyed, thinking he was getting another present. The young master pulled the box closer, not understanding why she kept sending him this junk. Cardithiel opened the box and saw a big teddy bear with a red bow inside, holding a letter in its paws. Cheryal's son opened the envelope and started carefully reading the letter. In the letter, his mother wrote that she wouldn't bother Cardithiel in the garden anymore and asked how his knees were doing. The boy's memories painted a picture of the Countess, arrogant and haughty. The kid remembered his mother saying he irritated her, so what could have possibly changed her mind so drastically? The butler walked into the room and, seeing the young master sitting up, asked if he was awake. Cardithiel, not noticing the servant's arrival, jumped in surprise and quickly tried to hide the letter. The servant noticed the kid tossed all the gifts, but kept the letters. He apologized to the boy out loud. The guy asked if the kid needed help getting changed, but the boy said no. The butler asked what he should do with the gift box and the teddy bear. Cardith, standing at the mirror and putting on his bow tie, started thinking about the best way to handle things. The servant already grabbed the box and offered to ditch it so the missus wouldn't notice. Suddenly, the boy ran up to the guy and told him to hold up. Snatching the bear from the package, Cardith announced he'd keep the toy, but the box could go in the trash. The servant smiled happily and figured the young master liked the gift this time around. The kid said he decided to keep it, not because his mom gave it to him, but just because he liked it. The guy picked up the box and said he'd only toss that today. Cardizel turned around and said he wanted to ask the butler for one more thing before he left. A scream came from Cheryal's room, loud enough to hear outside. She was calling her maid to come look at something. The heroine held a piece of paper and said that Cardizel had replied to her. Margot congratulated her mistress on the happy news and asked what he had written. Cheryl started carefully reading the note from her son. Cardizel had written just a couple of lines asking her not to send him any letters or gifts. The maid read the letter and tried to comfort the girl, but she convinced her that everything was fine and she hadn't expected it to work anyway. The heroine admired how beautifully her son had written the note, and the maid said he was learning everything quickly. Cheryl said she was happy to receive a reply letter from Cardizel for the first time. Margot guessed that the boy just didn't know his mother very well, since she had never shown any interest in him before. The maid said she was happy to see you smile, ma'am, because it's the first time she's seen you like this since you arrived. Cheryl thought about the girl's words, realizing she hadn't smiled or laughed at all in the Duke's house before. She remembered her husband's face when she first saw him in her room, and then the expressions on the servants' faces. They were all so grim. It was like they weren't worried about Cheryl's well-being, but about what she might do to them. The heroine grabbed her head and realized she had no memories of the duchy at all. She looked at the maid with doubt, wondering if she should ask Margot something. Seeing her mistress's thoughtful gaze, the maid tilted her head and asked what was wrong. Cheryl decided not to rush things and said that if she got closer to the boy, he should stop hating her. Margot said that's exactly what would happen and suggested they go see the young master in person. The heroine started having doubts, wondering if she should even do this, since he could get hurt again. She voiced her concerns to the maid, saying they didn't even know where he was right now. Margot mentioned that the young master had been going to the garden a little earlier than usual lately. Cheryl was surprised he was there and thought she'd promised not to bother him there anymore. The maid said she was sure Cardizel wanted to see his mom and promised to help her get ready. The garden near the mansion was bathed in sunlight, and the lush greenery added vibrant colors. Walking along the paths, our heroine thought she'd acted like she had no choice. But was this really the right thing to do? She wondered what she would even say to her son when she saw him. Suddenly, in the distance, the blonde spotted Cardizel sitting on a bench. Cheryl was happy to see Cardi in the garden, but noticed the unhappy look on his face. Trying to ignore her son's grumbling, she asked how his boo-boo was doing. The kid crossed his arms and said it was fine, whatever. Cheryl glanced at his knee and saw he'd used the ointment she'd given him. She noticed Cardizel had been in the garden a while but hadn't touched the sweets. She figured that couldn't be right, but asked if he'd been waiting for her. He gave her an indignant look and said, "No way, I wasn't." Cheryl said she thought he wasn't coming today, but he said he's pretty much always here. Picking up a fork, Cardizel said there's no reason to leave just 'cause someone showed up. She asked if she could sit with him, but he said no. She knew he was still being careful, but he wasn't leaving, so she asked if she could just watch. The guy poked at his dessert with a fork and just gave a cryptic when asked. Cheryl promised she wouldn't bother Cardi while he relaxed, just hang out nearby. The heroine noticed her son was finally eating and thought kids had a good read on people. Looking at the boy, the girl realized he looked even cuter today. Cheryl was sorting the mail and saw that even though she hadn't been part of high society before, there were still tons of invitations. The Duchess was copying and pasting polite declines since she just didn't have the time for social events right now. The heroine announced another invitation reply was ready, and Margot, who was standing nearby, praised her for the good work. The maid asked for permission to ask a question, and Cheryl told her to ask whatever was on her mind. The servant asked if Madame was trying to get closer to the young master, and the girl replied that she was actually making progress. Margot asked if Cheryel's diary really contained observations about the people who hated her. The heroine wanted to know how the maid came to that conclusion, since she was just writing down everything about Cardizel's kindness. The girl instructed the servant to only respond to important invitations. Picking up the emerald diary, the Duchess pondered what to write in it today. When they first met, Cheryl wrote down everything she found endearing. One of the entries read, "Cardizel ignores the heroine when she tries to talk. It's cute." The blonde noted in the diary the fact that her son nodded at her when she greeted him in the garden. Next entry, "He rejected all my gifts, but he liked the teddy bear if the maids are to be believed, and he even replied to the letters." Watching her mistress from the side, Margot remarked that she was practically glowing with happiness. The maid said that since the mistress writes about how sweet the young master is, why not show him? Hearing Margot's suggestion, Cheryl pondered her words. The heroine wondered if showing her son her journals would bring them closer, and the maid was surprised her mistress agreed. The maid said that, in her opinion, it was a great opportunity to connect with the young master. Cheryl picked up the diary and said it was a fantastic idea. The girl thanked Margot for the suggestion and promised to be back soon. Walking through the mansion's hallways, the heroine passed servants, while wondering what the boy's room looked like. The Duchess figured he's still a kid, so it'll probably be pretty cute. Cheryl wondered what colors the nursery walls might be and guessed there'd be lots of toys. Freezing in front of Cardi's room, the girl thought she was even scared to knock. Gaining courage, the heroine raised a trembling hand and knocked. Waiting for Cardi's reaction, Cheryl mentally reminded herself to breathe. Since nobody answered, the heroine figured she'd knock again. A kid's voice piped up from behind the door, asking who was there. The boy yanked the door open, and without even looking at the girl, he asked again who it was. Cheryl knelt down in front of her son, said hello, and showed him a pen with a bear head on it. Cardi didn't say a word to the Duchess, just turned around and slammed the door in her face, even though she said she wanted to show him something. The boy cracked the door open, curious, trying to see what she was talking about. Cheryl held up the bear figure again and smiled at her son. Taking the pen from the girl's hand, Cardizel announced he was only letting her in because he was in a good mood after eating chocolate. Looking around the room, the heroine thought it wasn't what she was expecting at all. Glancing at the bed, Cheryl saw a teddy bear tucked in and said she was happy he liked the gift so much. Cardicelli tried to shove the teddy bear under the pillow, saying he just didn't want to throw it away. The kid realized he couldn't hide the whole toy and asked what Mom wanted to show him. Cheryl held out an open diary to Cardi and told him to read it, mentioning she wrote it all herself. Pretending he wasn't interested at all, the boy took it and started flipping through the pages. The more Cardicelli read, the redder he got, and he finally asked what the heck this stuff was. Suddenly, flames erupted around the guy, and the diary in his hands turned to ash. The fire went out as fast as it started, and Cardi glared at Cheryl. The heroine remembered it was Duke Loperan's skill. The novel said only someone who inherited it could become the heir. The girl was thrilled that her son possessed such an ability, but she was really bummed about the diary. Cheryl felt Cardicelli tugging on her skirt, trying to get her attention. The Duchess said it was no big deal, and figured if her son didn't like it, she wouldn't write stuff like that anymore. Cardi, not looking his mom in the eye, asked why she named him that. The kid wondered why she shortened his name instead of calling him Carditzel. Sheriel started worrying that the kid didn't dig the nickname she came up with. The little guy pointed out that she called him Cardi. She knelt down, took his hands, and asked if he even wanted her to call him that. Sheriel looked at the boy with tenderness, eagerly waiting for his answer. The girl couldn't wrap her head around how such an innocent little dude could grow into the tyrant from the novel. The blonde knew she didn't want to see him messing with people or hurting the heroine. If he's loved and learns to love himself, he's got to turn out different in the future. Sheriel decided she'd be a real mom to him from now on, and the kid just blurts out that he actually likes the short version of his name. Cupping Cardi's cheek, she asked him to give his mom 10 minutes a day. The kid looked at her, totally confused, and asked what she even wanted that for. The Duchess apologized to her son for taking so long and explained she wanted to teach him something. She decided to explain to Cardi how to treat someone with respect, how to love and care for others. The kid looked at Sheriel, kinda embarrassed, and agreed to her request. But turning away, the kid clarified he'd only give her 10 minutes, and that was it. She smiled and thanked him for the chance, promising she wouldn't let him down. The sun was shining, and a couple of doves were fluttering over the flowers. Sheriel looked at Cardi and couldn't imagine how he'd turn into a tyrant, robbing people of their freedom. Blondie realized the whole problem was that nobody had ever given a damn about him, so he didn't know what it was like to love or be loved. The girl decided she had to raise her son right, and the kid looked at her and asked what she was plotting. Sheriel explained she was just trying to figure out where to even begin. Looking up at the sky, she asked what Cardi would do if he caught a beautiful bird. The boy froze, then asked again about the bird, clearly not getting what she was on about. Cardicel asked if, in that situation, you'd need to build a really secure cage. Taking his answer the wrong way, Sheriel perked up and said that wanting to give the bird a home was wonderful. Picking out a strawberry from his dessert, the boy finished his thought and said if he really liked it. In that case, he'd lock it up tight so it could never get away from him. Hearing what her son really meant, the girl was seriously taken aback. Cardis tried to justify his decision, saying that if he let her go, she'd bolt immediately. The heroine realized that no matter how hard she tried, the inner villain was still slowly showing itself. Not getting an answer from his mom, the boy asked why she was quiet and not saying anything. Not wanting to upset the little guy, Sheriel said she was amazed by how deep his thoughts were and suggested they read a book next time. Cardi said he didn't mind, but the heroine didn't get where she went wrong, assuming the boy had been like this from the start. Not showing her disappointment, the girl smiled, but wondered what she was supposed to do now. Sitting at her desk in her room, Sheriel thought things were even worse and didn't know how she was supposed to raise her son now. Margot, who'd called for her mistress several times already, lost it, walked up to her, and yelled right in her ear. The maid said she'd called her several times already and asked what was bothering the Duchess. The heroine immediately remembered how the boy burned the diary because of his intense emotions. The maid asked if the mistress was worried about the master coming home soon. Sheriel wondered if Margot was talking about that tall, handsome guy she met on day one. The girl frowned, deciding that a kid needs both parents, and her husband coming back was perfect timing. The Duchess decided to cook up a plan to get her son and his father closer. Sheriel asked when the Duke was due back, and the maid said in 2 days, barring any unforeseen circumstances. Margot said she knew it was a blunt question, but would Madame be unavailable when the man returned? The girl looked at the maid, confused, and asked what that was supposed to mean. The maid said that lately, Sheriel's been thinking a lot about the young master, so the mansion's buzzing with life. Margot clenched her fist and said she wanted to ask the heroine for a favor. The woman bowed and asked the mistress to just greet the master when he gets back, just once. Sheriel was totally taken aback by the maid's request. The Duchess couldn't believe the old Sheriel had such a messed-up relationship with her husband. Seeing her mistress's reaction, the maid apologized, saying she just got carried away with joy being around her. The heroine smiled at her subordinate and said she'd definitely greet her husband. The maid kept trying to explain her request, but froze, not believing what she just heard. Sheriel looked at the maid, who was stunned, and asked what her name was. Narrowing her eyes with a sly grin, the blonde asked Margot to tell all the servants that the lady of the house was going to meet the Duke. To herself, the girl thought that she'd never let the cute kid become a bloodthirsty tyrant. A beaming Margot clasped her hands together and happily thanked the Duchess. The maid spun around, shouting as she ran that she'd spread the word immediately. Sheriel said everyone's prepping for the Duke's arrival and she needs to wrap up this paperwork ASAP. An important thought just popped into her head, so suddenly that she didn't even finish writing. The Duchess realized she still didn't know and hadn't even asked anyone what her husband's name was. A column of horses and riders was moving down the long driveway in front of the mansion. The guy holding the horse's reins asked if his lord was all right. Without looking up at his subordinate, the Duke said he didn't want to go home. A young dude who suddenly appeared nearby wondered if his reluctance had something to do with the lady of the house. The knight asked the nosy guy if he had a death wish, and the kid apologized. The Duke waved his hand and told them to cut it out, warning that they'd be arriving soon so they shouldn't waste time jawing. The man decided he'd try knocking again this time, even though she was probably not even at the mansion. The Duke looked ahead and saw his mansion coming into view. All the house servants were lined up at the entrance, bowing respectfully as they greeted their master. The man dismounted his horse, carefully observing the scene, not understanding why everyone was outside. And then the brunette saw something that surprised him even more. At the end of the line of servants stood his wife, dressed in a beautiful, light-colored gown. The Duke couldn't believe his eyes. The girl had never come out to greet him before. Sheriel stood in the distance, watching her husband with half-closed eyes. The Duchess smiled, adjusted her hair, and told her husband that she had been waiting for him. The master watched what was happening, unable to understand what had transpired during his absence. The Duke turned to his knight, who immediately reacted and stood waiting for the question. The guy was babbling about being out of his mind and told them to call a doctor the second they walked in, but Red over there insisted Sheriel was the real deal. She walked towards her husband, who couldn't believe he wasn't just seeing things. The Duchess smiled and said it was a chilly wind today, suggesting they head home quickly. The Duke couldn't figure out what was behind his wife's sudden kindness. The guy asked what Sheriel was up to this time, not buying her good intentions for a second. She decided to keep her plans to herself and suggested they go inside. He couldn't believe his wife was waiting for him and figured she must have some memory problems after the accident. Sheriel noticed her husband wasn't following, turned around and asked if he was coming, since she'd had his favorite meal prepared. Leaning into Margot, she reminded her about her request, and the girl told her to trust her on this. The Duke and Duchess walked in silence through the mansion's massive hallways, not even looking at each other. The guy looked around, realized they were alone, and Sheriel was stoked that Margot followed through. The Lord gave the woman walking beside him a suspicious look. The heroine strolled along, all smiles, but her husband couldn't remember her ever acting like this before. The Duke reached out, going for her shoulder. The Duchess turned her head towards the man and asked what they were going to do. Sheriel clarified, wondering what they'd do in the dining hall, but first, chow time. The guy agreed with his wife, not even thinking about arguing with her. Walking past the woman, the Lord thought this couldn't possibly be real. The Duke turned and looked at the girl, who was grinning at him. The guy narrowed his eyes, all suspicious, and asked if something had happened in the dining hall. Sheriel said nothing was wrong. She just figured her husband wouldn't want to wait for the food to be ready. The Duke looked at her but didn't say a thing, deciding to just go along with it. Walking to the table, she announced she wanted to tell the head of the house something. The man gripped the back of the chair, thinking his wife actually did want to talk about something. He figured she wasn't the type to talk without expecting something in return, especially considering how much she disliked him. For a moment, the dining room was silent, and the couple didn't speak. Sheriel started eating, thinking she was about to explode with anger at her husband. The Duchess didn't get why the man was talking to his wife, who'd been getting ready for his arrival since dawn. Cutting a piece of meat, she decided to take matters into her own hands. If she missed this chance, another might not come. Tilting her head slightly to the side to avoid a vase, she called to the Duke, determined to steer the conversation in a certain direction. Sheriel said she had something to tell the new guy who just arrived. Putting his knife down without looking at his wife, the man told her to speak her mind. The heroine asked if work had been tough, considering the long commute. Sheriel's husband reached for a piece of meat with his fork, but froze when he heard the question. The man immediately pointed out that the Duchess doesn't usually talk like that. Not knowing what else to say, the girl just said she was worried. The Duke was surprised by his wife's new words and asked again if she was really worried. But the guy immediately suggested that Sheriel was hoping he'd get hurt and not come back. The heroine shouted that she definitely never even thought of anything like that. Putting down his silverware, the man said he'd noticed his wife doing things she never used to do. Sheriel was mentally cursing her husband's words, but figured that's about what she expected. Deciding not to delay her plan, the Duchess stated that they had a son. The girl said she wanted to talk about Cardizel, specifically his upbringing, and suggested spending more time with the boy. The Duke shot up from his seat, pushing the chair back with a loud scoff. The man said his wife talks like she hates his guts, and suddenly she wants to co-parent their son. The Lord said that after the accident the heroine hasn't been herself, but she insisted she was fine. Sheriel rushed to her husband and offered to talk things over, but the Duke stepped back from her and told her not to come any closer. The man asked if the Duchess really thought he'd fall for this charade. The girl looked at the Duke with disappointment and said that she wasn't faking it. In Sheriel's memories, she flashed back to the first time the boy pulled his hand away from hers. She was thinking about how Cardi fell and tried to push his mom away. The heroine figured she wanted to settle this peacefully, just by talking it out, and didn't get why this dude was so pissed. Sheriel doesn't want sweet little Carticel to grow up to be some second-rate nobody. The Duke was leaving the dining hall and told his wife that if she had nothing to say, he was heading out. She realized she wasn't finished talking and yelled for her husband to wait up. But suddenly, Sheriel felt weak and a sharp pain and started to fall to the side. Seeing what was happening, the guy moved fast and caught her before she hit the floor. It was evening outside, and candles were lit in the Duchess's room, lighting her up. Tucking a blanket around her, the Duke asked why she suddenly passed out like that. Sheriel said that if he's gonna glare and not say a word the whole meal, anyone would faint. The heroine felt like her legs would give out just standing near him. He radiated pure evil. She glanced at her husband, but he turned away, closing his eyes. Sheriel asked if the Duke really hated her that much. Instead of answering his wife, he decided to throw the question right back at her. He asked if Sheriel hadn't hated him for a long, long time now. She looked at him, stunned, and asked if he honestly believed that. To herself, the heroine wondered what Sheriel could have possibly hated him for before. The Duke took her hand and said that the moment he got close, she'd start crying and throwing pillows. Pressing on a spot on her palm, he accused her of acting like she didn't remember anything. Sheriel yanked her hand away, and he, surprised by her reaction, said he barely even pressed. The Duke gave the heroine a sad look, saying nothing. Taking her hand again, the man mentioned how cold her hands were. He said that even if she didn't like being touched, she needed to bear with it for a little while. Sheriel looked at their hands, surprised, and agreed, not resisting. The husband glanced at the heroine and said patience was key. The doctor would be here soon. A crowd burst into the room, led by a doctor yelling about needing to examine the Duchess. The man quickly got up and started to leave as the doctor approached the bed, Sheriel watching him go, confused. The girl called out for him to wait, but the doctor told her not to strain herself. The Duchess was worried that she couldn't even have a proper conversation with her husband. Sheriel was angry that it was impossible to become friends with the men in this mansion. They were rejecting her. The next day, bright sunlight burst into the room, flooding it with light. The girl lay in bed, still feeling absolutely awful. Sheriel thought about how she wanted to raise a child in a happy family, but how could she ever connect with her husband? She knew the dinner had been a disaster, and she had zero desire to try again. Leaning back against the pillow, she wondered aloud what she was supposed to do now. There was a knock at the door, and Sheriel couldn't imagine who it could be, since she'd told Margot not to let anyone in. She realized that if the maid couldn't stop the person, it was either her husband or Cardi. Her imagination conjured up images of how each of them might enter her room. She clenched her fists happily, thinking that maybe, just maybe, it was Carticel. Sheriel went to the door, where the knocking continued, and asked hopefully if her son had come. A little hand opened the door, and in the other, he held a bear-shaped candy. The boy walked into the room and confirmed it was really him. The heroine was overjoyed to see her son, inwardly celebrating that it was him who came. The kid said he'd overheard the maids talking about how his mother had fainted. Sheriel thought Cardi had come to see her simply because she was feeling unwell, and she was pleasantly surprised. The boy held out the candy to his mom and said, "You need to eat well when you're sick." The girl took the gummy bear from her son's hand and thanked him for thinking of her. Cardi heard his mother's words and looked like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't have. The kid said that wasn't why he came. A maid just asked him to. Sheriel knelt down in front of her son and told him she was still grateful he came to see her. The heroine ruffled Carticel's hair and told him she was glad he came to visit anyway. The boy, not used to his mother showing affection, froze in stunned silence. Cardi appreciated Sheriel's gratitude, but she didn't understand why the kid was looking at her so strangely. The girl asked if her son liked it when she petted him. Carticel touched his hair and asked her not to do that again. Sheriel was upset by his response, but apologized and promised not to do it anymore. The kid said if she was so tired she was about to pass out, she didn't need to eat with his dad. The heroine asked if the little guy was worried about her, but he sternly replied no and turned away. The girl thought about how he could lie so badly and still be so cute, and then said aloud that she'd have to get used to it. Cardi looked at the woman suspiciously and asked if she was really trying that hard. Cheryl said she had to try since the guy was her husband and Cardi's father, but she figured she was doing it all for their son. The kid looked down at the floor and asked if Mom thought Dad was more important than him. Cardi whined, all bummed out, saying that now she'd be spending all her time with his dad. In a fit of emotion, the little dude spun around and stormed toward the exit. The kid kept complaining as he went, saying that his parents even had dinner alone without him. The Duchess ran after her son, realizing he must think he's being forgotten, and caught up to him, hugging him from behind. Holding him tight, Cheryl said that no one was more important to her than Cardi. The little guy frowned, held his arms out wide, and asked if that was really true. Despite her son's mood, she didn't let go, telling him that nothing was more precious to her than the time she spent with him. A sad little smile crept across Cardi's face, 'cause he still wasn't totally buying what she was saying. He pulled away from the woman, saying that wasn't what he meant, but she noticed how cold the kid's voice sounded. Cheryl remembered he still didn't really like her that much and just said she understood. Suddenly, the boy turned around, dropped to his knees next to her and hugged her back. Totally caught off guard, she called her son's name, surprised. Cardizel opened his mouth a little like he was trying to say something, but hesitated. Looking into Cheryl's eyes, he quietly started to try and say something, and the first syllable was Ma. The boy's eyes went dim with confusion, and he didn't finish the word he was trying to say. To fill the silence in the room, Cardi tried to tell his mom to go get some rest. The little guy said she needed to eat a chocolate bear so she'd have sweet dreams. Cheryl, overwhelmed by the kid's actions, hugged him even tighter and promised she would. A couple days later, the Duchess, all dolled up, was checking herself in the mirror, wondering if Cardi would show. Margot said he would. The maid said the kid's gonna be stoked when he finds out his mom made him sweets. Cheryl smiled at the box in her hands and said, "Here's hoping." The park was beautiful again, perfect weather for a stroll. Cheryl was heading towards the kid at the table, Margot trailing behind. Cardi looked at his mom, curious, and asked, "You feeling any better?" She said, "Your advice really did the trick. I'm feeling much better." Cardi crossed his arms and said, "Like I promised, I'm here in the garden." Cheryl turned to the maid and asked, "Could you give me a hand with this?" And the girl happily agreed to do whatever she needed. They pulled out the cake from the box and started cutting it into little slices. The lady said she brought it for her son to eat and offered him a piece. Cardi perked up when he saw the walnuts on the cake. He loves those. The kid thought nobles ate cake with forks, but he wanted to use his hands. Margot said the young mistress had been working hard since morning, and Cardi could eat the treat however he liked. The boy agreed, put down his fork, and grabbed a piece with his hands. The young master brought it closer and closer to his mouth. And finally, Cheryel's son tried his mom's cake with a happy smile. The boy pulled the cake away from his face and looked at the treat with doubt. The Duchess looked at him hopefully and asked if he liked it. Cardi kept staring at the cake and delivered his verdict. It was awful. Cheryl was totally bummed, racking her brain about what she messed up. Underbaked the dough, not enough sugar? She apologized, saying first tries always suck, but she'd try harder next time. Carticel held the pastry, staring at her in shock, asking if she was the one who baked it. Cheryl said she'd heard Carticel liked stuff like that, but since she'd never cooked before, she screwed it up. The kid took another close look at the nutty dessert, thinking about what to do with it. Deciding his mom's feelings were more important, the little dude bravely started finishing his piece. Cheryl yelled that it was okay, he didn't have to force himself to eat it. Cardi told her he wasn't forcing himself, he was eating it because he actually liked it. The young master ordered Margot to give him another piece from the box. She was sure it tasted awful, but her son insisted she just needed to give it a chance. Cheryl thanked them and promised she'd try even harder next time. After tea, she walked through the huge hallways, thinking Cardi had been really sweet and said such nice things. Deciding she had to get closer to her husband for that adorable kid's sake, the Duchess knocked on his door. Knocking again, she announced it was her, figuring she should flash a smile the second he opened up. The door was opened by Kate Velmore, Duke Loperan's right-hand man. Bowing to the Duchess, the guy told his boss Cheryl had arrived. Without looking up from writing, the young man asked what was going on. She said the servants were having some issues, so she came to ask for his advice. Without even glancing at his wife, the Duke said he was busy and didn't have time for this. The temperature in the office instantly dropped a few degrees because of how cold his answer was. Sheriel and Cadavel felt like a ton of bricks just landed on them. The Duke asked if the woman couldn't see he was busy and told her to scram. The Duke's right-hand man, with a practiced, polite smile, said he had some business to attend to. Giving his subordinate a hard look, the Duke said he had no business and would be staying put. The heroine and Cadavel gasped in unison, while Sheriel wondered if the Duke couldn't spare even a minute for her. The Duchess headed towards the desk and said her husband was stuck doing paperwork for hours, suggesting a walk in the garden. The guy didn't hesitate, instantly replying that he was busy, and the right-hand man's jaw nearly dropped. The Duke repeated that he wanted Sheriel out of his office. Cadavel, with an awkward smile, said the Duke seemed way too busy today. The subordinate thought that the Duke was actually happy his wife came. The guy said it's too late today, so the young lady can come back tomorrow morning. Sheriel, not showing any emotion, walked away from the Duke's office, but suddenly Margot appeared at her side. Seeing a familiar face, the girl finally let her feelings out and covered her face with her hands, and the maid asked if she was okay. Pulling herself together, Sheriel smiled in response and thought that nothing was okay, but maybe it's for the best. The heroine turned towards where her husband's office was and fell into thought. The Duchess decided that there was nothing complicated about it, she just needed to come up with a reason to go into the office. The next day, Sheriel was sitting in her office and realized that she had nothing to do. The girl immediately started deciding which book to read to Cartazel today. Margot came into the office and announced that a letter had arrived for the lady from Marchioness Penzel. The letter expressed gratitude that the Duchess had agreed to attend the Marchioness's son's birthday. Sheriel thought it was weird, since she always turned down invitations, but I guess she must have been mistaken. After reading it more closely, she realized it was a birthday party, and the maid asked if the lady was talking about her own celebration. Margot asked if they should start preparing ahead of time, thinking that her mistress had changed for the better. The maid assured her that they could put together a lavish ball, but Sheriel cut her off, saying that wasn't the point. She didn't know what to do now, since it would look like she cared more about other kids' birthdays than her own. The protagonist said the ball would be in 2 weeks, and she'd heard of the Marquis de Penzel somewhere before. The Duchess started frantically trying to remember where she might have heard that name. Suddenly, it hit her. She remembered a boy named Radius Penzel. Sheriel started racking her brain, trying to recall what she knew about that character from the book. She remembered that he was the main character's assistant, and Cartazel took him out. Pressing a finger to her lips, she thought her son better not lay a hand on anyone ever again. The Duchess was at a loss. Every choice felt like a no-win situation, bound to cause trouble. Sheriel decided right then and there she wouldn't let Carty do that. She'd raise him right. Placing her hand on the table, the girl turned to Margot, catching her attention. The heroine declared she needed to see her son immediately and ordered an escort. In the study, the Duke was scribbling away on some documents. His right-hand man stood by the desk. Checking his watch, Catewell mentioned the master's wife would be arriving soon, and he still couldn't believe they saw each other every day. Glaring at his subordinate, the master snapped that if he had too much free time, he could easily fix that, but the man declined. The Duke mused that ever since the accident, the girl was like a different person and had stopped avoiding him, which was weird. Memories of their past life, before the accident, started flooding back into the man's mind. Sheriel wouldn't let anyone touch her and would start screaming every time the master took her hand. The Duke told him that the girl had even stopped looking his way. Sheriel frowned, clearly annoyed, and asked why she should even bother. The man just asked her to smile at him once in the morning, at least. Turning away from her husband, the blonde ordered him to leave, saying she had nothing more to say. Now his wife brings him tea to ease his weariness and suggests they drink it together. Sometimes Sheriel finds out the Duke is going to patrol the area and asks if she can join him. When the cook bakes something tasty, she might come over, offer some, and chat for a bit to take his mind off things. The man remembered how the girl smiles now and calls out to him. The Duke wondered if Sheriel would smile when she came to see him today, and even though it was a long shot, he still held out hope. "Hey, boss!" Cadavel barked out suddenly, loud enough to startle his superior, who'd just dropped a huge ink blot on the documents and hadn't even noticed. Clutching a stack of papers to his chest, Right Hand observed that the man was burning the candle at both ends. The younger man tore a sheet from a notepad, saying it was no big deal. Cadavel glanced at his watch and mentioned the Duchess was running late, but he could go check on her. Pushing back from his desk, the man shoved the papers away, saying he was about at his wit's end. Heading for the exit, the Duke said this office was a soul-crusher, so he was going for a walk. Cadoval asked where he was headed, and, gesturing towards the documents, said there was way too much unfinished business here. Fastening the top of his cloak, he asked his right-hand man if he wasn't supposed to be lending a hand. As his boss walked away, the subordinate mentioned that if he was going to find his wife, she was usually in the garden at this hour. The Duke told him not to talk such nonsense. If they happened to bump into each other, it would be purely coincidental. Catewell waved goodbye to the guy's back and wished him good luck. The Lord walked through the mansion's hallways, looking around like he was searching for someone. Suddenly he heard a shout claiming someone was lying, and the Duke recognized his son's voice. Sheriel leaned down to her son and asked why he thought his mom was lying to him. Cardi said that she always goes to his father first, even though she says he's the most important person to her. The kid slammed the book shut and asked if she even liked being with him. The Duke, who was eavesdropping on the conversation, froze quietly by the door, curious about his wife's answer. Sheriel looked at her son, wondering what the best thing to tell him was. The man thought about how he was just standing there listening in and couldn't believe he'd sunk this low. The Lord touched his forehead and mentally reached out to the woman, saying that feeling had been in his heart for a very long time. Little did she know, her husband was right outside the door when she confessed she liked Cardazel better. The eavesdropping husband was floored when he heard his wife say that. The kid puffed out his cheeks and turned away from his mom, calling her a liar. Sheriel took her son's hand and told him she wasn't lying. She told him she came to ask if he wanted to hang out with Marquis Penzel's son. Cardazel looked at his mom and asked her to repeat the name of that Marquis. Sheriel said she'd been invited to his birthday party, and she thought they could go together. The kid's eyes went wide, totally surprised by the invitation. Cardi wondered if they'd need to bring a gift for the birthday boy. She asked if it wouldn't be better if she brought the gift instead. A beat later, the girl just stared at her son, totally confused by his reaction. The kid's eyes went blank in an instant, then filled up with these bitter tears. Cardazel started yanking his hand away from his mom like crazy, accusing her of never giving him anything. Sheriel figured she shouldn't have brought up the gift, since the old her never celebrated her son's birthdays. The kid backed up against the shelf and asked if she really thought things would be okay after all this time, or if she just wanted to hurt him again. The heroine remembered a while back, the little guy followed her around, calling for her, tugging at her dress. That Sheriel turned around and ordered him not to call her mom, and then said she couldn't stand the sound of his voice. Her head started pounding in the present, and she couldn't believe she used to treat the boy like that. The heroine reached out to Cardi, trying to say something to calm him down. Suddenly the kid screamed at her, saying he didn't need a mom or anyone else for that matter. Tears streamed down Carditzel's face as he said he didn't believe Sheriel anymore. The little guy chased after his mom, tugging at her dress, trying to get her attention. The blonde stopped, turned around, and told him to never call her mom again. The kid's eyes welled up and he reminded her that it was his birthday. Sheriel glared at her son and asked what she was supposed to do about it now. Still clinging to her dress, Carditzel asked if she was even going to wish him a happy birthday. Gripping the hem even tighter, the kid begged her to just say it once. The girl didn't like what her son was doing and sternly said his name, trying to get him to behave. Sheriel yanked her dress out of his hands and ordered him to stop acting like a baby. The little guy reached out to her, still hoping to get some love from her. Right now, Cardi was crying, terrified that the same thing that happened before was gonna happen again. She grabbed her head again after another memory. Sheriel figured she was hurting herself doing that. She was kicking herself for not being there for her son back then, for missing his birthday. Deciding to fix things now, she hugged him tight, pulling him close and begging for his forgiveness. She was crying, unable to forgive herself for the past, not understanding why she treated him that way. Cardazel struggled to break free from her embrace, screaming that he hated her. Calming down a little, the boy leaned into Sheriel and repeated more quietly that he really did hate her. She apologized for abandoning him back then, for not helping and for not knowing how to love. Wiping the tears from his face, she promised him it would never happen again, and she'd give him real love. Cardazel looked at Sheriel confused and said, "But I hate you." Leaning her forehead against the boy, the woman told him she loved him. A little while later, Mom and son were in the living room when Sheriel suggested throwing a huge bash for Cardi's birthday. The boy sat on his mom's lap, all grumpy, and said he hated having a ton of people around. The woman said that Cassel loves sweets, right? And if a lot of guests come, the cake will be massive. Turning his head away from Sheriel, he said she could do whatever she wanted and deal with the party herself. The heroine said it would be a special day for Karditzel and asked if there was anything he wanted. The woman started brainstorming gift ideas for her son, and the kids started thinking about what to ask for. Cardi whispered quietly that he wanted to hear birthday wishes. Sheriel didn't catch what the little guy said and asked him to speak up. The boy got shy but repeated that he wanted to hear people wish him a happy birthday. The heroine realized that whenever she started thinking about Castle's past, she just wanted to break down. The girl promised to do her absolute best, and the guy pointed out that his birthday wasn't for ages. Placing his little hands over his mother's, the boy said he wanted to be the first one to get birthday wishes. Sheriel looked thoughtfully and a little sadly at her son, then called his name. The girl put on a cheerful face and asked the boy to spare her some time tomorrow. The heroine suggested throwing Cardi a party in his favorite garden. The boy wrapped his arms around his mom's neck and hugged her tight, agreeing to her idea. The Duke, who'd been standing outside the door the whole time, was listening intently to the conversation between his son and wife. The man decided to move away from the room where his family was, but he made a mental note about the party in the garden tomorrow. Walking back towards his study, the Duke thought that tomorrow was going to be a long day. The next day, the Lord went out to the garden and heard loud congratulations for Karditzel. With a displeased look on his face, the man thought it was way too noisy. Last night, the Lord dumped all the paperwork on his right-hand man, who had no idea what he did to deserve that. Remembering Catewell's crack about the man having trouble with his wife, the Duke thought the servant was completely out of his mind. The Lord approached the gazebo where many servants were gathered, along with his wife and son. Sheriel gushed over Cardi sitting next to her, saying the suit really suited him. She gently wished her son a happy birthday, playing along with the party's theme. Congratulations echoed around, and the boy happily started blowing out the candles on the cake. Sheriel started looking around because she had this weird feeling of unease creeping up on her. The heroine saw the Duke and knew where those feelings were coming from. Turning back and seeing how happy her son was, the girl steeled herself to step away. Approaching her husband, Sheriel wondered what brought him here. The Duke asked what they were up to and pointed out the heroine's ridiculous hat. The heroine frowned, asking what was so funny about it, and that it's actually pretty hard to make. Sheriel said they were having a party for their kid's birthday. She explained that Karditzel doesn't like big crowds, so she decided to hold it here. The man paused for a moment, then asked why she was suddenly doing things she'd never done before. Sheriel thought her husband was acting weird. Usually he's intimidating everyone, but today he's just asking questions. The heroine smiled and said aloud that she decided to throw a party because Cassel is so adorable. The Duke asked if she wasn't the one who used to pawn their son off on the nanny because she couldn't even stand to touch him. She realized that even though she sometimes saw Sheriel's memories, she never felt the same emotions. The guy crossed his arms and said she was acting like a totally different person, and now he didn't think she was faking it anymore. She told him that she'd changed, which meant they needed to raise their son together. The Duke looked down and pointed out that Sheriel's son called her by name, but she still only called him Duke. A dark mood settled over him, and he figured his wife probably didn't even remember his name. Sheriel was caught off guard by his question, and her face showed she was deep in thought. She'd asked Margot about his name, but forgot it since she never used it. The Duke started getting pissed at his wife, demanding she say his name, his frown deepening with each second. Sheriel was trying to find anything in her memory that could remind her of the man's name. Seeing that she wasn't answering his question, the young man asked what the deal was. The blonde knew if she couldn't remember her husband's name, things were going to get awkward. Then a name popped into her head. Not quite right, but better than nothing, and she blurted out, Kian. The guy was surprised she'd shortened his name like that, and so sweetly too. Sheriel said she liked the name Kian, and asked her husband what he thought of the nickname. Kian blushed, embarrassed, and turned his head away so she wouldn't notice. She couldn't remember the full name, so she had to improvise, but it looked like it backfired. The guy thought, usually, she's the one putting up walls in our relationship, so why the sudden change? Kian wondered if Sheriel had really changed, thinking about what might happen if this kept up. The girl noticed he was silent and asked if he really didn't like it after all. The Duke said his wife could call him whatever she wanted, but he wasn't done with work, so he had to go. The guy just turned on his heel after that and headed in the opposite direction of the party and the girl. Sheriel breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it all worked out, but then Cardis was already walking up behind her. The little dude came up to his mom, tugged on her dress, and she turned around. Looking up at his mom with eyes shining with curiosity, the boy asked what she'd said to his father. Happy to see her son, Cheryl replied that she hadn't said anything like that to the man. It dawned on her that Curtis might have wanted his dad to wish him a happy birthday too, and she'd totally missed it. The girl knelt down in front of her son and apologized for messing up. Cheryl explained that the Duke was upset with her because she hadn't invited him to the party. She said that Dad came to wish Curtis a happy birthday, but he's super busy, so he could only stop by for a minute. Curtis pushed his mom's hands away from his cheeks and said he was annoyed that their conversation was about his dad again. The woman leaned down to the kid and said the party was still going on, and the little guy whispered a word. Cheryl asked him to speak up, 'cause she wanted to hear what her son was saying. The little dude's mood brightened, and he told his mom they made a cake. Giving in to her kid, the woman followed him, not knowing what to do when he's this cute. The servants were telling the young master that this cake was the best one yet, and his mom picked out all the stuff to make it. Cheryl admitted she didn't bake the dessert herself, but she was real careful about picking the ingredients. The boy asked if she'd celebrate with him next time and held out a strawberry on a fork. The heroine was touched by her son's gesture, and the servants around them were cheering about the family's bond. Cheryl knelt down next to Cardi and promised she wouldn't forget, because it's the day her precious son was born. The woman said this party made up for all the ones she missed, but the next one would be even more awesome. The Duchess's eyes went wide as she looked at her son. The kid laughed, all happy, and asked if she promised to keep her word. She felt a pang of sadness, remembering something he'd said about just wanting to feel any kind of gaze, even if it wasn't real. Cheryl's chest tightened. She wondered who he'd said that to. Tears streamed down her face, and Cardi got scared, asking why she was crying. In a flash, the Duchess smiled and told him not to worry, that they were just tears of joy. Inside, Cheryl's heart was breaking. She didn't know how much longer she could lie to the little guy, and silently begged for forgiveness. Cardicel said he'd heard that sweets make things better. The boy held out a fork with dessert towards his mom's mouth, telling her to try it because the cake was super good. Cheryl ate the piece he offered, and Cardi asked her how it tasted. The Duchess said the cake was delicious and thanked her son. The servants watching the nobles were touched, thinking this was what they lived for. Cheryl thought she felt strange, maybe because of the memories. It shouldn't be hard when she's happy. A couple of days later, the girl was sitting in her office as evening fell outside. The heroine was at her desk, signing various documents and responding to invitations. Cheryl stretched and announced she was done, and Margot thanked her for the work she'd done. The maid asked if her mistress would go to see the master now, but the girl said she wouldn't right away. The Duchess remembered Cardi asking her why she came. He doesn't want to deal with those who don't keep their promises. Cheryl said she was very sorry, but something urgent came up and she had to. Cardicel said it was okay, but next time he wouldn't accept any excuses, because he's more important than anything. "Sweetheart," the woman said, cupping her son's face, "nothing in the world is more important to Mommy than you." Cheryl turned to her husband, saying, "I heard you're tied up again today?" "I brought tea," she said. "Where should I put it?" He just told her to sit down. She thought, that's kind of weird, isn't it? Usually he just tells me to get lost. Kian pointed to the piles of work but said, "Stick around, I don't mind the company." Her maid was shocked she hadn't bolted already, but Cheryl thanked her husband for letting her stay. Hearing Cheryl call him Duke again, he reminded her, "It's Kian, remember?" The guy put down his pen and changed the subject. He asked, "Are you planning on seeing me before you go see Cardicel?" Snapping out of her thoughts, she wondered, how am I supposed to juggle two guys who both want my attention? Out of nowhere, Margot says she's got a solution for the madam's problem. Cheryl was stoked and asked what kind of plan the maid cooked up.